world is once again thinking about nuclear weapons, not as relics of the Cold War, but as real instruments of power, politics, and risk. Whether it's Netflix's new movie, A House of Dynamite, or President Trump's promise to restart nuclear testing, or the famous movie Oppenheimer that released around 2 years ago, the nuclear weapons are back in the headlines. The old rules of deterrence are fraying, arms control agreements are collapsing, and billions of dollars are being spent on systems that promise protection but may ironically deepen instability. My name's A'ndre Gonawela. This is the Burn Bag Podcast, and this is a new mini series we are doing called The Nuclear Threshold. This is going to be a three-part episode. We're going to be talking about the myths and the realities shaping the nuclear world today. Together, we'll be unpacking the science, strategy, and the politics behind the most dangerous technology ever created, and ask what it would take to pull the world back from the brink. So, when we talk about nuclear security, we often think about missiles, warheads, and treaties, but not the quiet assumption that technology can save us. That is, if we just build the right system, we can stop the unthinkable. My guest today on our first episode in this mini-series is Dr. Laura Grego, who has spent her career challenging that idea. She's an astrophysicist and the research director at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she spent decades studying why missile defense systems may not necessarily work the way we're told they do, and how creating an illusion of safety can actually make us less secure. From Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program to today's billion-dollar Golden Dome, the United States has poured billions of dollars into trying to build a shield against a nuclear attack. But as Dr. Grego explains, the physics haven't changed and neither has the risk. This is the first episode of the Nuclear Threshold. Laura, thanks for joining me here today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, Andre.
So I want to start the conversation by talking about the promise versus the reality of missile defense. For decades, US leaders have promised that technology could make us safe from nuclear missiles, providing a kind of, quote, shield against an attack. You've written that missile defense has been, quote, more promise than delivery. Why has it been so difficult to make that promise real?
Um, since we've been building missiles that could carry nuclear weapons across the globe, we've been investigating technologies that might be able to defend against those missiles, since the 60s. And if you read the story of missile defense, you'll often see there's a big goal for it. It's going to have an expansive vision. It'll stop Soviet missiles. And then when they find out that our systems aren't really going to work that well, the goal for it tends to shrink to fit the technology and shrink and change. So rather than sort of create a goal and develop the technology that fits it, it's almost you'll often see, oh, it doesn't really work as we think it will. So let's find a different thing for it to do. Of course, you'll see a pretty dramatic change in the Reagan era, where the vision was expanded to sort of an impenetrable defense against Soviet missiles. But that's sort of how it works. But it's at heart is a very difficult technical problem. So basically, a nuclear armed missile, an intercontinental ballistic missile, which I'll say ICBM for short in the conversation, is a missile that can travel extremely long distances, around like 10,000 kilometers, many thousands or thousands of miles if you think in that unit, that allows you to carry something from, the United States to Russia or China to the US or back and forth. So when that was paired with the ability to carry nuclear weapons, that was extremely, alarming, because you can fight an adversary without having to bring soldiers there. So these missiles are, They go extremely fast. To do that, they have to go around 30 times the speed of a jet. So they're streaking through space really fast. And they deliver this nuclear warhead, which is pretty small. It's sort of the size of a mini fridge or a file cabinet. And the idea that you have to destroy that while it's, making a journey of tens of minutes through space, it's a really hard technical problem. You have to find it. You have to find a way to destroy it all within minutes. You have to know it's been launched, track it, target it, all of those things. So that is, as a technical challenge, it's a really challenging problem. So despite investing, I think at this point around $400 billion, maybe more over those years, we've yet to field a system that can do that in a robust, reproducible, effective way.
So in 2002, under President George W. Bush, the United States withdrew from the Anti Ballistic Missile Treaty, opening the door to building
Mm.
nationwide missile defenses. Can you tell us a little bit more about that treaty, the rationale behind the treaty, and
Yeah.
how that decision to withdraw from it changed the course of US strategy? Like what expectations it might have set, and what we're still struggling with today with regards to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in 1972, the US and the Soviet Union negotiated and concluded the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And that strongly limited the fielding of what we call strategic missile defenses, which we were describing, defenses that can stop an intercontinental ballistic missile armed with a nuclear warhead. And one of the key rationales for that was to try to prevent arms racing, because the way this bilateral relationship shaped up was that the two countries were in a state of mutually assured destruction, and have convinced themselves that the reason we're not fighting nuclear wars is that if you start one, everyone will lose. That's encapsulated in the sort of famous quote, a nuclear war can never be won, so must never be fought. So but if you try to escape that mutually assured destruction logic by building defenses against your adversary, so you're escaping that mutually assured destruction, your adversary will have an incentive to build more offenses. And then you build more defenses and you build more offenses. And then all of a sudden you have many more missiles pointed at each other. And at the height of the Cold War, there were some 60,000 nuclear weapons. And when, one of them can destroy a major city, and if dozens of them can destroy a civilization, 60,000 is, the definition of overkill. So to try to walk ourselves back from this competition, one of the keystones of the arms control regime that followed in those years from the 70s was that we strictly restrict defenses so that we can now reduce offensive weapons, the nuclear armed missiles. And so we were able to conclude a series of arms control treaties through the 70s, 80s, et cetera, to bring down that number from 60,000 to today. There are, I think around 12,000. I'd have to get that exact number. But the current for the United States and Russia, who are still in the sort of scraps of the last existing bilateral treaty, now we're allowed to field around 1,500. So in 2002, so there have always been people who are uncomfortable with mutually assured destruction as a way to assure security. I'm one of those as well. And I think Ronald Reagan was, looked at that logic and said, there must be a better way. And what I want to do is escape this entirely and make it impenetrable defense. We can all benefit from it, get rid of nuclear weapons. That was in 1983, and that, of course, didn't follow through. So I think that logic still carried through the next 20 years. But there have been people who really think it's important that missile defense, we should not limit ourselves. And I think there's a strain of people who think any limits are problematic. The United States should have entire freedom of action in all ways. And some of those people were in the George W. Bush administration in 2002. And so when the United States abrogated the treaty and withdrew, it was actually in the wake of the events of September 11th, 2001, when there was a lot of goodwill towards the United States, and it was very difficult for anyone who had a different point of view to contest or to argue against national security decisions by the administration. So that abrogation of the treaty had a fairly muted response at the beginning. But at the time, uh, you know, Russia started to make plans to hedge their bets. While the United States at that time, again, had the idea of missile defense was pretty squarely focused on um, smaller states like North Korea, Iraq, and Iran at that point. Um, None of them had ICBMs with nuclear weapons at that point, but that was the idea, was not to defend against Russian arsenals, but to focus on sort of what they termed rogue threats or emerging nuclear threats. And that would be the focus. That was sort of the guarantee to Russia. Don't worry about it. We're just really focusing on these small ones, but we really need to build missile defenses. Russia started to hedge its bets and build systems that could evade, overwhelm, or confuse missile defenses. And we see those types of systems coming to closer to maturity today, sort of 20 years on. Systems that would be complex, challenging to figure out how to defend against and how to incorporate in our defensive structures. So, so the idea that the United States would not limit itself, I think, had strategic implications that we continue to see today. So while the United States started to build these systems, and the system we have today, the ground-based mid-course defense, was initiated right after this withdrawal from the treaty. You um, you know, this bargain, we're going to do this to create our safety and not worry too much about, you know, the other effects. I think like sort of today we're seeing where we ended up 20 years of sort of what did you get for your defense and where did you land with your adversary's offenses. So.
So you mentioned the ground-based mid-course defense system, or the GMD. I mean, the United States has spent so much money, poured so much money into missile defense, including around, I believe, maybe 50 to 60 billion dollars into that GMD, which is basically our main line of defense against these long-range missiles. So how did the politics and the urgency following the withdrawal from that aforementioned treaty drive that system's development perhaps more than science would have?
Yeah, so missile defense, as you can imagine, has always been very political. Whether you think it's a good idea or not, often falls along political lines. You can see that's always been part of the debate. Um, and it was important politically for the Bush administration. They made promises. They said we're going to have this, and so essentially what happened is they used technology that had been developed in the 90s. Um, I mean, it's sort of flipped to say they picked up whatever was laying around the lab, but it wasn't totally different than that. It wasn't okay, we have these specific needs. We're going to develop what the technology that works best for this. We're going to proceed in a rigorous way. What they did was basically immediately exempt the missile defense enterprise from the normal oversight procedures we use for big military projects. So there's a set of like research development and testing and fielding requirements sort of under this umbrella of what we call fly before you buy. And that those regulations have been developed over years when we realized like we were buying things that weren't fully developed, that didn't work. So it sets, a set of milestones. Once you meet these criteria or it's working this well, then you can proceed to the next. Totally took missile defense out of that and just sort of sped things started pouring concrete, started fielding stuff, started buying stuff in order to meet sort of political timelines to say, yes, we've done this. They had an election coming up. We need to say we have a system working. And you can see over those years, even official statements about how well the system worked, they were always extremely positive, even saying like it's going to work 90% of the time, even before we'd had any tests of the system, even before we had interceptors in the ground, really sort of painting the system as a real success. And so because it didn't have this rigor built in, they fielded interceptors. So interceptors are the heart of the system. They're the thing that slams into the incoming missile. Um, even before they were tested, they were put in the ground. So we had a bunch of stuff that we'd committed to, a technology that we'd committed to, a pathway, a way of doing things before we knew that they worked. So that's completely backwards the way you'd build a system that you wanted to count on. You want to know how well it works before you start buying and start going down a technology path. But it was, sort of consistently a political project that we have to have this. This is important to us. This is part of our identity. This is the way we do things. And so it's never held to the same rigorous standards that systems are supposed to. And you can see that reflected in its test record. Since since around 2000, there have been about 20 tests of the system, which is not very many. It's less frequent than once a year. And for a system that's supposed to be a major strategic system, that's a real problem. That's not enough information to know how well it works. Another problem with the test system is that they've never tested it against, very hard problems. There are lots of ways you can challenge a missile defense that are well known, have been known for decades. And if you really want to know how well it works, you want to include those in your test to see how well it, where is it not working? Where do I need to
Yeah.
improve it? They were, as we call, scripted for success. And so you see in this test record, even though they've been scripted for success, even though they're not happening very often, it's about a 50-50 test record. But yet it keeps getting passed, sort of, I don't know if it's grade inflation, but yeah, you didn't pass your reading test, but we're going to move you up to sixth grade, rather than being like, okay, you need reading lessons. So it's kind of the way the system has continued to go. No one has like really been like, oh, they've had a hard time, calling it.
And that's
So,
scary to me because I mean, I remember as a kid, there was some website that sort of gave you a map of the world or the United States, and you can sort of test out all the different sort of types of nuclear missiles that have been in existence or were in existence. So when I was living in San Diego, which is a military town, I mean, probably one of the targets, like if there was
mhm,
to be a war, I remember going in as a kid and being like, okay, like if I drop this bomb at this place, will my house get destroyed and so on?
yeah.
And then I'm like, well, like probably not because we have missile defenses that will solve the problem. We'll be able to shoot them all down. So those that great inflation scares me quite a bit. And I mean, even like at the more rudimentary level, right? Like for a lot of the general public, when they think of missile defense, they may think of the Iron Dome, which a lot of people were able to see on social media in action just, in the last year when Iran was lobbing missiles at Israel, at Tel Aviv, and they remember seeing the images, right, of these interceptors hitting these Iranian missiles, which are far more simplistic, I think, than the missiles that we are talking about. And even then, we had missiles that still ended up hitting Tel Aviv, including some buildings, for example. So if that even doesn't work, and we're trying to create the Golden Dome, we're looking at investing in the GMD, and we're only doing 20 tests since its creation, that is quite scary. And I mean, when we think about missile defense, we're often thinking about it as hitting a bullet with a bullet. Can you explain a little bit about the science behind why hitting a bullet with a bullet, why intercepting not just any missile but a nuclear missile in space is such a technically daunting challenge?
Yes. So I think hitting a bullet with a bullet is not a bad metaphor. It's actually a pretty good one. So as I mentioned earlier, an ICBM, which is the thing you're trying to hit, it launches the way you should think about it. If you've seen like a video of a space launch, that's kind of what it looks like. It's a big energetic event, and it gets your nuclear weapon, which is encased in a hardened reentry vehicle. It gets it going very fast because it has to go very far. So fast and far go together when you're thinking about missiles. And then it quickly goes up out of the atmosphere, and it spends about 20, the whole journey is about 30 to 40 minutes, but most of it is like cruising through outer space, actually, the vacuum of outer space as it travels from, from its launch point to its target. It's cruising through space going very fast, and it's not very big. As I mentioned, it's, sort of the size of a file cabinet or a mini fridge or maybe a fridge. So in the vastness of space, it's a very small point. And so one of the problems is knowing where it is exactly and where it's going. Luckily, it's under free fall of gravity. So once you get a good sense of where it's going, you kind of can predict its future path, which is why we can imagine defending. So the defense, basically the way the current system works is it has also kind of close to sort of an ICBM launcher, which launches a kill vehicle, which is also the size of similar size as a warhead. And then that gets that going up to speed towards a calculated, what we call intercept point. So you think you know where this one is going, and then you send one. And the idea is for them to smash into each other and for the kill vehicle to destroy the nuclear weapon with the force of impact. So they're two objects going sort of 30 times the speed of a jet, very small, and you have to be you don't get extra chances. You might have the ability to try a few times, but you don't get repeated chances before it's either destroyed or it lands. So that's one, it's a big global problem because you start over here. So you have to have radars along this long path. You have high speeds and you have small objects. So that's the problem with the sort of hitting a bullet with a bullet. But that is, while that sounds hard, that's actually not the hardest part of this problem, because you're floating through the vacuum of space. And what that does is like there's no air resistance there. So if like you and I were standing at the top of a building and I handed you an anvil and a balloon, you'd really instinctively know which one would land first because there's air resistance on the light balloon and the anvil would just drop. But in the vacuum of space, a balloon and an anvil would travel indistinguishably. They're just floating through space. So you can do the analog in space. So your anvil is your nuclear weapon in a reentry vehicle. And then you have a bunch of balloons that look like that reentry vehicle. And they don't cost you much to put on because they're really lightweight. You could put dozens of them. And then you have to force the defense to pick out which is the dangerous object and which are the ones you can ignore. Within this really fast time frame. And that turns out to be the hardest problem because you don't have much time. You can't distinguish by the way they're moving. And yet the adversary has lots of ways to make those balloons look confusing. And so you'd force the defense to target all of those separate objects and use up their interceptors, use up their defense, or risk having something come through. So the types of tests that our system has been tested against have been those early ones without very confusing countermeasures. And we're still working the problem of hitting a bullet with a bullet, but haven't seriously grappled with this bigger question of actually in a real situation, there's lots of things that can make it much harder.
So if you're saying that the 20 tests we've done since we created the GMD have a 50-50 success rate, and those are far more simplistic tests that don't involve, say like decoys or jamming or multiple
Mhm.
warheads that would sort of
Right.
occur in the real world, not just that single clear target, that so theoretically changes the odds of success for US defenses quite significantly, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, if it's 50-50 in the testing environment, I mean, like, I'm a little concerned now that it's going to be like 1090 in the real world.
So I actually hesitate to give an actual number because I don't know it, and I actually think the test program doesn't tell us enough to give a reliable answer about how well the system would work. One, because as we talked about, the tests are, as it called, as we've described them, scripted for success. They're not challenging the system in ways that we know an adversary would try to challenge the system. So we don't really know well enough how they would work. We know it's probably pretty low. And so the way that you try to fix that is like using a bunch of them against any threat. In case one doesn't work, you add another, but you don't have a lot of time. So you kind of have to send, I would expect you'd probably send 3 or 4 against any incoming threat. But that, as I said, it kind of quickly runs out if you have an adversary that has decoys and other targets, you can quickly exhaust your interceptor. Um, so I guess where I would land on that is, we don't have a lot of information about how well the system works. We have some, but we know it doesn't seem very reliable. So I think that's sort of your bottom line. It's not something that provides a lot of protection in the real world. And it's pretty hard to scale up because each of these interceptors cost a lot of money and you have to dig a silo. And so it's a pretty hard problem to work. And I think as you talked about Iron Dome at the beginning, and I would just say a word about that. Like those are very different problems. Iron Dome was sort of devised to defend against like artilleries and mortars and shorter range threats that don't go very far and don't go very fast. And also the consequences of missing any one of them is much less devastating than missing a nuclear armed missile. So the stakes are also much different, and they don't have like they don't cruise through space, and they don't have the opportunity to confuse with decoys like a mid-course strategic missile defense would. So they're even though the original title for the Golden Dome project was the Iron Dome, which I think tried to get a little of the glamour of the
Yeah.
Iron Dome program, there's sort of totally different physical problems.
So when we're thinking about missile defense as well in this sort of modern era now in 2025, one may think about all these new technologies we have, from artificial intelligence to advanced sensors,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, that those things may perhaps make missile defense work better than it would have 10 years ago. Do you think that these innovations really change the equation, or are we still essentially running up against the same type of physics?
So we're going to be running up against the same type of physics. So the type of missile defense we described, which is the way that GMD system, the ground-based mid-course defense system works. That mid-course describes the way, the part of the nuclear weapons journey that you're trying to hit it in. And that's the cruising through open space. And of course, there's always ideas that new technologies will provide a breakthrough, especially in this tricky countermeasures discrimination problem, which we described, which is having to figure out where the warhead is when it's hidden among decoys that look like it, or you make all of the objects look different and you have to pick them out. That confusing part. I don't think artificial intelligence really helps you there, because what you have to do is make choices based on phenomena that you can observe. You have like, you know, basically radars, which can tell you something about where the object is and how it moves, and a little bit about how it looks, and infrared, which is on like the seeker, like the interceptor for the defense, has got like a camera that's looking at it and trying to see how bright it is. You only have a few things that you can observe to put together and create a picture for yourself of what the objects are and which is the one that's threatening and which isn't. And artificial intelligence doesn't get you very far that way, because you have to, have um, lots of data to feed into your AI system. And that data is the food, like, for AI to do its job, is lots of instances to feed into this. And as we've already talked about, there are a few tests. There's not a lot, and your adversary doesn't give you a bunch of data about their program that allows you to know what they might do. So I don't think that really gets you very far. And so where we end up turning, or where the missile defense story has turned a number of times in this 60-year history we have of it, is like, well, mid-course defense, this one that's susceptible to decoys, is so hard. Let's try to get those ICBMs before they can do that, before they can launch these decoys and confusing countermeasures. And that brings you to what's called boost phase defense. And that is, let's catch those missiles as they're launching. So that ICBM, as it's coming out of its silo and it's burning its propellant to get the ICBM going fast enough to send its nuclear weapon across the world. So what you're doing is trading one really hard problem for a different hard problem. But that's sort of where the Golden Dome project is headed, is towards boost phase. And so the issue with that is that burning phase, that boost phase, only lasts 3 to 5 minutes. And that range depends on the sophistication of that launching missile. But even 5 minutes, it's not very much time to know that a missile is launching, figure out where it's going, cue your defense, and destroy the target. That's a very short amount of time to do a big, significant thing. And that timeline, so that kind of restricts you from being hundreds of kilometers away from the launching missile's path rather than, thousands. You have to be pretty close if you're going to get there in time. And for like a small country like North Korea, which is about the geography you would create if you thought you might create one that might work for that. It's a peninsula surrounded by international waters and international airspace, where you might conceivably get within hundreds of kilometers. That's one thing. But a country like Russia and China, which are big, you could just pull those launchers very far away from the borders and you'd have no chance to catch those launching missiles. So in order to get close enough to that launching missile to catch it before that 5 minutes is up, you go to space. And normally, like people, your intuition is space is far, space is big, space is far away. But in this case, space is actually close. Low Earth orbits are hundreds of kilometers from the Earth's surface. So you can imagine getting close enough to a launching missile from space in order to intercept it as it's launching. Um, so again, as I said, you've traded one hard problem for another. The problem is being in space means being in orbit, and anything in low Earth orbit goes around the Earth every 90 minutes. So as soon as it's in the place and time that you want it, it's gone again. So in order to have something in the right place at the right time to provide protection at all times, you need hundreds, but probably thousands of orbiting weapons in order to catch a launching missile. And if you wanted to catch two launching missiles who are launched from the same place and same time, you'll need twice as many interceptors. If you want 10, you get 10. If you want to provide, more than one per target because you're not sure they all work, you keep doubling. And so really rapidly, your problem becomes how do I build thousands or tens of thousands of interceptors in order to provide a fairly modest defense? So while we know that there are technological developments in, making space equipment less massive and less expensive and space launch is less expensive, we're still talking hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions, to do a system like that. So while innovation sometimes makes things easier, you improve things at the margins, I don't see it solving the problem of missile defense in a significant way.
Yeah, and I mean, when we talk about that proposed Golden Dome project by the Trump administration, which would be this massive new missile shield spanning the country, I mean, there's obviously a lot of controversy around one, the price tag of this thing, two, the efficacy
Yeah.
of this thing, but also like three, could something like the Golden Dome actually contribute to more destabilization or a new arms race? For example, earlier in this interview, we talked about how pulling out into this and into from that treaty could actually embolden folks to build more, as we were sort of seeing in the
Hmm.
60s and the 70s, right? Like you're building more missiles, they're building more defensive, missiles, and therefore I want to build more so I can penetrate those defenses and basically outmatch, right? To make sure that mutually assured destruction is the way to go. How do you see similar arguments now playing out with the Golden Dome for countries like Russia, China, or those rogue states like North Korea?
Yeah, so there are a couple of important things to know about the Golden Dome proposal, which originated in an executive order earlier this year in January 2025. And one of the things it did, which was pretty radical, was um, change. So since even before the U.S. withdrew from the ABM Treaty in 2002, it's been U.S. policy to not target Russia and China with missile defenses. It's been, strictly limited to a small number of launching missiles from emerging missile states. And as you said, the reason for that is to keep things stable so we don't end up in this arms race, offense defense arms race spiral that's very unhelpful, which doesn't allow us to do nuclear reductions that we think make us safer and to create a more stable regime. There's a lot of instability in that. Um, that's been bipartisan policy, pretty stable, and even through the expression of administration's intent, which new administrations often do a missile defense policy. That's been consistent. The Golden Dome executive order upends that and says, actually, we're gonna defend against basically any kind of missile from drones up to nuclear armed ICBMs from any adversary, including peer, as they call it, peer and near peer, which would capture Russia and China. So that was a pretty radical departure. That puts Russia and China on notice. They've been suspicious this whole time that the missile defenses that the US has been building are maybe oversized or overambitious for a North Korean threat. And I think China in particular has worried, not just because of missile defense that has no end, but US advances in targeting persistent overhead surveillance, the ability to know where their mobile missiles are, the ability to potentially um, upend their command and control and make a U.S. first strike um, conceivable. So meaning like that the US might take out China's ability to respond, and missile defense would be part of that. So if the United States decided to strike first against Chinese nuclear forces, it might not get everything, but missile defenses would clean up the ragged rest. So China's always been expressed a lot of concern about just the general path for US missile defense. And Russia has always sort of been concerned as well. They've both been particularly concerned about space-based missile defense and have coordinated on like diplomatic initiatives to try to quash that. So I think sort of the Golden Dome not only says we're going to do space-based missile defense, which is something we haven't done, it expressly aims missile defense against Russia and China, which they've been suspicious for a while, but now it's sort of you said the quiet part out loud and said that's what we're doing. So while they've been preparing a bit for that technologically, Russia has been building systems, has been investing in systems of different sort of, I would say, maturity, systems that can get around missile defenses, like a nuclear powered cruise missile, which would sort of circle the globe. They call it a flying Chernobyl because it's
Mhm.
pretty dangerous to fly a nuclear reactor around the world on a cruise missile, but approach the US from an undefended corridor. Or a nuclear powered underwater drone that would be undetectable by, by most US defenses, or a bunch of different technologies that when you look at them together, these are really designed to evade, overwhelm, avoid, missile defenses. So you see that starting to happen. They started, in fact, they were, you know, had some recent tests in the last few weeks. And China's thinking about its own strategies too. How do we assure ourselves and maybe assure the United States that this strategy is not obtainable, that you can't strike us first and decisively get rid of our nuclear weapons? And so you see China, I mean, I can't know their decision making. They haven't said this out loud, but you can see them expanding their nuclear arsenals and experimenting with different delivery systems, different ways to approach this. So we're starting to get in, as you described at the beginning, sort of a dangerous period of potential arms competition, instability. So missile defenses can kind of sit square in that and provide fuel for the fire by saying we're interested in escaping this mutually assured destruction. We don't want to be vulnerable to you. And your adversaries are going to react by either building more or different offensive systems. And now the United States will probably face more, what we're seeing sort of more threats without, I would argue, a path to a robust defense, so you don't get anything for the cost that you're paying.
So, I mean, for the older listeners, for this episode, they may be sort of harkening back to the Strategic Defense Initiative, otherwise known as Star Wars, which was proposed by President Ronald Reagan back in the 1980s. A lot of critiques there, a lot of ridicule there, which hence the name Star Wars, about, could we actually shoot these ballistic nuclear weapons in space, for example. And I feel like I'm sort of hearing a lot of the same sort of arguments and debates around that as we are about Golden Dome right now. Uh, but even if the technology then wasn't necessarily realistic at the time, I feel like I recall, like, hearing about it sort of being a centerpiece of a lot of those negotiations in the latter part of the 1980s between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. I think around 1987, the Reykjavik summit, I think the SDI issue was what essentially torpedoed those negotiations in
Mm.
87 between Reagan and Gorbachev. But it was sort of this weird negotiating piece, this sort of weird piece of leverage, right? Could you see something like the Golden Dome bringing people like China, like Russia, to the negotiating table on nuclear weapons? Or is that too game theory esque for this
I,
particular example?
I'm not a political scientist.
Yeah.
I'm a scientist, but a close observer of these things, and that would be, I would say, a good a good path forward, a useful path forward. I think Russia has, even if you look in the preamble of New START, which is our last remaining bilateral nuclear arms control treaty, it's identified pretty clearly, excuse me, in the preamble that they see a close connection between offenses and defenses. And they've said pretty explicitly, if we're going to do another round of arms control, we're going to need to have those conversations about missile defense. And that was pre-Golden Dome. So there may be more urgency here. I would certainly urge the United States to consider that, just sort of take, there's a lot of sort of technical euphoria around Golden Dome right now because there's a lot of
Yeah.
money to be made, a lot of, you know, no, there's no part of this apparatus where it seems like it benefits anyone to say, slow this down. This actually isn't realistic. You're going to spend a lot of money and not get much. In fact, you might end up being more dangerous. There aren't a lot of places in the system where there are people who are sounding that alarm bell. There are some. But to be able to say, hey, like, I don't think we're going to get much out of this. We're not going to get protection that's promised. We'll spend a lot of money. So let's think about how we can uh, how can play a constructive role in arms control by considering limits on them, and agreements. I would say that would be like a good use of of, of this missile defense program.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so as we round this interview out, I mean, despite all of these gaps that we have talked about around missile defense, Congress still wants to keep funding missile defense at enormous levels. Why is it so untouchable of an issue? Is it the fear? Is it lobbying? Or is it just this idea or the appeal of trying to make ourselves seem invincible and not really trying to broach that unsaid fear that this all
Yeah.
could fail?
Yeah. I wish I actually knew the answer to that question because I've been asking that for as long as I've worked in this. Like, I think there are I think there's a real and rational response to vulnerability to nuclear weapons that everyone has because they do pose an existential threat to human civilization. And it's something we need to figure something out about. We absolutely have to. Uh, and if I think if you don't look too deep into the details, you might think missile defense is a good answer to that. And sort of politically, you want to have an answer to your constituents. What are you doing about it? You'd say, well, we're investing in missile defense. We've got this. It's there's a political upside to that. I think there are, of course, from the cynical point of view, people who make a lot of money from it. They're very clever and spread the development across states. And when there's money being spent, people want a piece of that. Um, so and then I think there are true believers who think, well, American exceptionalism, the US has enormous economy, great innovation, has had exceptional ability to attract scientific and engineering talent, and which I hope continues into the future. I don't know how assured that is, but that we will figure it out. So I think it's sort of one of my mentors has always described missile defense as the idea that sounds good after 30 seconds, but you need 3 minutes to hear the rest of it. What are the downsides? So I think we don't think through the rest of that. So it's a pretty, as I agree with you, it's a pretty robust, like popular program. So in the sense that I really wish that we, though, examine those details and make sure we're not kidding ourselves and making bad choices out of unwarranted optimism.
So what should we do? I guess. I mean, we talked
Yeah,
a lot about the problems and the gaps, but like, I mean, someone may listen to this and be like, okay, so like how do we solve this? How do we
yeah.
defend the homeland? How do we resolve all of these very scary situations? Like,
hmm
what in your view should we do?
Yeah, that's the right question. So often when you get this question, like, what's the right missile defense policy? And so I would argue that we don't want to isolate that from how we think about nuclear weapons writ large, because I worry that what focusing on missile defense does is kind of take your eye off the ball. The ball is how do we reduce the risk of nuclear war and that they'll be used. So, like, I know you haven't seen House of Dynamite yet, but if you think of it as the House of Dynamite metaphor is that we've built this very dangerous machine that we're threatening nuclear war at all times. I feel like missile defense is a fire extinguisher, right? It doesn't solve the essential vulnerability that we've created this thing. So you have to step back and say, how do we reduce the risk of nuclear war by stepping down high alert levels on nuclear weapons, by having sensible nuclear policies like that, like not investing sole authority in the president to make this decision, having a couple of advisors required, by seriously engaging with appropriate energy and seriousness on arms control treaties with countries that we might not like or get along with or trust, find ways forward to reduce the risk of nuclear war overall. And I would say that is absolutely where we should be investing our treasure, our intellectual energy, our diplomatic energy. And while missile defense may play an adjunct to that in certain situations, I think imagining we have a technical solution to nuclear vulnerability is a missed opportunity. We don't want to take our eyes and try to pursue this when the actual path is a different way. It's not going to fix the problem. So I think you have to think, how do we do this? How do we reduce the risk of nuclear war overall? And that, of course, is going to. So sorry, hopefully you can patch this together. Sensible nuclear policies that reduce the risk of nuclear weapons being used, and then eventually disarmament. I don't think we're not going to live indefinitely along with nuclear weapons into the future. So we're going to have to find some way to get rid of that threat. And I would say that's hard too. But missile defense's problem is, that isn't going to fix it either. So we need to get to work.
Laura, thank you so much
Yeah.
for joining me here today. I really appreciate it. Folks, this is the first episode in our mini-series, The Nuclear Threshold. We'll be having Dr. Steve Feder on next week, and then Alexandra Bill the following week to talk about some of the other challenges, but also solutions around this very scary topic of nuclear annihilation. But folks, if you haven't seen it, go watch that Netflix movie, read Laura's work as well. But for now, Laura, thank you.
Thanks so much.